Sarah didn't stand over me long. She said what she said and then went into the house. The one called Bubba stood up and grabbed me by my collar, dragging me as he followed her. The sisters trailed behind us, snickering. There was also the third male Mundy, who seemed to be the youngest of the group. He hung back with the girls, looking like he ain't got a single fully functioning brain cell. The Mundys had a childlike demeanor that was anything but cute. The happier they got, the uglier they looked. Behind the sisters and the younger Mundy was Collins, that smug piece of shit. Bubba yanked me over to the door beneath the stairs. The door was open. My dad and the other male Mundy were nowhere in sight. "Let him walk," said Sarah. Bubba let go of me. I stood up and could now see that I was about a foot taller than Sarah. She was thin and hunched over, and her face showed no emotion. "Where's my dad?" I asked. She nodded towards the opening where the padlocked door had previously hung shut. I could see that beyond it was a dimly lit stairwell that spiraled underground. I stepped in. Lantern flames flickered along the walls as I descended the stone stairs. This was not stone like you'd see in a castle. These steps seemed to be carved from the mountain itself. "Knock on the door when you're back up." I turned to see Collins close the door and heard the click of the padlock. It was now just me, Sarah, and Bubba. The sisters and their younger brother stayed upstairs. I continued down the steps. I could hear the distant rattle of chains, the sharpening of blades. "Collins, some kind of servant to you?" I asked Sarah. "He's kin." I coughed out a laugh. "Well, I'll be damned. He's ugly, but not Mundy ugly. How'd that happen?" Sarah didn't respond. I figured I wasn't going to get much more than that and continued in silence. As we descended further, the air became damper, like standing next to a group of people that had just finished breaking a sweat. I could hear sharp cries of pain and what sounded like the crack of a whip. I considered that maybe I truly was entering the depths of hell. Finally, the stairs leveled out, and I stepped into a cavern more enormous than I'd ever imagined existed. Spread throughout were old cages like medieval jail cells. In them were hundreds of people, all crowded together. They varied in age, some young, some old. They all looked dirty and tired, but fed. Torches illuminated the cavern. A little ways off, I could see folks walking around. Some wore shackles that rattled as they moved, while others were unrestrained. "Where's my dad?" I asked. Sarah nodded to a nearby cage. It was smaller than the others, and he was in it by himself. He'd taken quite a beating. His left eye was swollen shut, and his hair and beard were caked in blood. I ran over and reached my arms through the bars. I needed to touch him, let him know I wasn't gone. "Dad." He opened his one good eye and looked at me. "I reckon we fucked up. It's starting to look that way. This place, you can feel the evil in it, can't you?" I nodded. I'd done some work in a jail years ago, installing conduit and running wires for a fire system. The guards accompanied us around to the different spots and gave us the background on some inmates. One of them was a serial killer. He'd done some horrendous things to his victims. At one point, I was in his cell with him, fishing wires through the wall for a smoke detector. The guard stood outside to make sure nothing happened, but still, I felt the killer's eyes watching me. I could sense his appetite for human butchery. I felt his evil. I could feel the same thing in the cave. "Son," Dad said as he gripped my hand, "I'm sorry I waited so long to tell you the truth. Every father wants to see his son grow up to be a successful man, but I knew what waited for you if you ever did. Part of me wanted you to be stuck at home forever, so I'd never have to tell you about this nightmare." He gripped my hand tighter and continued, "I know you felt lost and lonely these past few years, and I figured if you ever found a girl you wanted to marry, that'd be the time I'd tell you. But listen to me. Your life on that land is paid for. If you can convince the Mundys to let you return to the surface, you can live there the rest of your days. You'll just have to pretend like everyone else that this shit ain't going on." "I can't do that, Dad. I can't live in the shadow of these monsters." Dad looked at me a moment and then smiled. "You're a stronger man than me." He reached through the bars and pulled me close, and I felt something solid drop into my coat pocket. "Give 'em hell." I backed away from the cage, looking at my father for what may be the last time. "They're waiting," said Sarah. I turned to her. "Who are they?" "You'll see." I noticed that the other Mundy was nearby and hurt pretty badly. Dad put up a good fight. Sarah motioned for me to continue walking. The poor souls looked from their cages as I walked past. Not a word from any of them. I heard a cage door open and watched as a captive was grabbed by two unshackled. He flailed wildly but wasn't strong enough to resist. They forced him onto a nearby stone table, where one of the shackled prisoners was made to strap the captive down with leather restraints. The man lay flat across the table, begging and screaming. Before I had a chance to react to what was happening, he was decapitated. His final scream echoed off the damp cavern walls. The prisoner unstrapped the body of the victim. The other two picked it up and carried it over to a wooden wagon and dropped it on top of a pile of other headless bodies. I was made to continue on. I saw as I passed the stone table that the victim's head was being sliced open on the top. They handed it to the prisoner, who carried it over to one of the cages. He tossed it inside. I didn't look long enough to find out what the prisoners do with them heads. I'd become queasy at the thought of continuing further and finding out what awaited me. But still, I pressed on. But all I could see up ahead was what appeared to be the end of the cavern. A dead end. As I got closer, I could see that up against the wall was another wooden wagon, and inside it were more bodies. But this wagon was only half as full as the other one. Next to the wagon was an opening in the wall. It didn't appear man-made, as it didn't have any consistent angles. It was likely old as the cave itself. It was small and narrow, and I could see a blood trail going through where someone had dragged bodies. I stopped near the entrance and turned to Sarah. I had nothing but hatred for this woman, but at that moment, she felt safer than whatever was on the other side of that wall. "Don't leave them waiting," said Sarah. Every fiber of my body told me to turn around and run, but I wouldn't have been able to outrun Bubba. I've seen the nearly inhuman speed he's capable of. And where would I even run to anyways? I was trapped in this hellish nightmare. So I pressed forward. I figured I would die either way, so I might as well learn who they are. I stepped into the opening and noticed that Sarah wasn't joining me. She waited outside, watching me move further into this other, darker section. The tunnel opened up, and I was in a cavern more massive in height than the other. The ceiling extended upwards hundreds of feet, thousands even. I realized I was standing beneath the highest point of the mountain. That feeling of evil was more pronounced in here, so thick you could almost taste it. There was light about halfway up. It looked to be an enormous fire-lit chandelier of some kind, hanging from the longest chain I'd ever seen. It wasn't fancy in any way and looked to be made out of branches and bones. I'd been so distracted by the size of the cavern, I hadn't realized something was moving ahead of me. The light from the chandelier only barely illuminated the ground below, so it was difficult to see at first. As my eyes adjusted, I noticed that this figure was facing away from me. It was large and dark and huddled over. Something protruded from its back, pointing outwards like spread arms. Then I heard a sound that will forever haunt me. The snapping of bones as limbs were torn from a body. The thing began to feast on a corpse, and I could hear crunching. This creature doesn't bother eating around the bone. Suddenly it stood. I thought this was some animal on all fours at first, but now I could see that it was something different. Something sort of human. This wasn't no ordinary human though. Not in build and certainly not in appetite. What I'd initially thought was black fur was a long, ragged gown. Very long. The creature stood at least 15 feet tall and had very long, thin arms. And its fingers were as long as my own arms. It turned around to face me, and I immediately froze. The thing had long, black patches of thin hair, and white eyes that pierced through the darkness. It was eating a torso. I'd once seen in a book a painting titled Saturn Devouring His Son. The image stuck with me because of how disturbing it is. This reminded me of it. The figure looked feminine. I could see exposed breasts through the torn gown. She tossed the torso aside and continued chewing, staring at me all the while. Once finished, she spoke. "Welcome, child." A chorus of voices of varying tones and volumes, the more prominent one being female, echoed throughout like a cathedral. The sound passed over me like a cold chill and lingered on my skin. Suddenly, hundreds of candles set in pockets along the cavern walls lit up simultaneously. I could now see the horror standing in front of me. She was tall and gangly, with a face like a rotting possum. Not an outwardly extending jaw like you'd see in one of them animals, but a sharp-toothed smile that likely wasn't there out of joy. Her skin was pale as the moon. From her back protruded long bones, like antlers. "Come closer," the voices echoed. I was frozen with terror, unable to move or speak. I don't know what I'd expected, but it wasn't this. "Come closer!" Her voice boomed. Singular. Masculine. "Who are you?" I finally managed to say. She breathed heavily, seemingly frustrated that I'd not yet moved. Then she exhaled. "We are the beginning."